On this channel, I've discussed aircraft that have failed for all sorts of reasons. Some were flawed from the outset, some were overtaken by the relentless march of technology, and others were more simply victims of circumstance. The Avia B-35 and the B-135 that followed belong firmly in that latter category. This was a fighter design, and a rather good fighter design if you ask me, that hailed from Czechoslovakia. That country's effort to produce a modern, homegrown fighter resulted in a genuinely promising machine, one that under other historical conditions might have made its mark in the same way as the Hawker Hurricane or the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Instead, it was condemned to strategic and historical obscurity by geopolitical forces that were utterly beyond the control of the engineers who designed and built it. Its story is not one of technical inadequacy, but one of a nation being dismantled faster than its aircraft could be built. The B-35 was a fantastic design for its time. Unfortunately, its time wasn't particularly kind to it. Aviation history is full of moments like this. Ideas that were sound, ambitions that were serious, and outcomes that hinged on timing rather than engineering talent. It's why stories like the Avia B-35 remain interesting long after the aircraft itself has vanished. Heck, it's stories like this that actually got me interested in the deeper complexities of aviation history in the first place. They invite you to ask that persistent question, the question of what might have happened under different conditions. Now that question is also why today's video is very kindly sponsored by Heroes of History. This game blends history, city building, strategic battles, and time travel. Yep, I'm not kidding, and it does a really good job at it too. Tutored by Albert Einstein and drilled by King Leonidas, you build up your civilization across the different eras of history, research new technologies, extend your territory, build a collection of historical heroes, fight Nikola Tesla in a giant robot, I'm not kidding, and in general you have a lot of fun with this. Now, I can genuinely say that I have been hooked by this game. I really love the element of collecting, training, and upgrading all of the different historical figures, and I was thrilled to see a hero from my own local history, which is Queen Boudica. City building is fun and intuitive without any needless bloat, the research and error systems give you a real sense of progression, and the combat system perfectly balances challenge and fun, and it does a great job of making use of all the different heroes in your collection. You have to consider elemental stats, timed abilities, range, buffs, debuffs, and special encounters. I also really love the fact that it's not a frantic or punitive experience. You can play it in shorter or longer sessions, you can focus on city building and research, or lean more heavily into the tactical side with campaigns, battles, alliances, or even seasonal events. Currently, there is a winter event, which is running from December the 11th until the 26th. Honestly, I love it, and I have not enjoyed a mobile game this much in years. The gameplay is fun, it has a fantastic soundtrack, and all of the heroes look amazing. In fact, the entire game looks amazing. I adore the art style they have chosen. The theme, the colors, the outfits, the beards. I mean, just look at Ulysses Grant or Karl Marx. Majestic. So to download Heroes of History today, scan the QR code that's on the screen or click on the link in the description below. New players can also use the code Rex's Hangar in the first 5 days to get some free in-game goodies and a boost towards their first 5-star hero. So thank you to Heroes of History for sponsoring today's video. Now, back to a fighter aircraft that never had the chance to find out what a more forgiving timeline might have looked like. Before we get stuck into the history, a quick disclaimer. First, there are some Czech and Bulgarian names in this video that I have found challenging to pronounce, so I apologize in advance if I make a complete cock of it. Also, I am aware that Avia is pronounced Avia in the Czech language, but I'm sticking with the English pronunciation as this is my third time recording this video, because I kept slipping between the English and Czech versions of this name, and upon re-listening to the narration I found it very jarring. Secondly, this is something of a sort of mini deep dive on the topic, I suppose, as I wanted to do it justice. However, there is not a comprehensive photographic record of these planes, for reasons that will become apparent very quickly, As such, this video may resemble a glorified slideshow at certain times. Now, I was going to add in some 3D renders of the Avias, but owing to a recent drama involving my computer, I can't do much 3D stuff until the new year. So, apologies for that, and moving on. The story of the Avia B-35 begins in 1936 when the Czechoslovak Ministry of National Defense, hereafter known as the MNO, launched Prototype Construction Program 23-308. It set out requirements for a series of new aircraft to modernize the Czech Air Force, and at the top of that list, under Type 1, was a requirement for a contemporary single-seat monoplane fighter. This would not be Czechoslovakia's first venture into monoplane design, nor Avia's. The company had produced the B-3 and a string of light monoplanes, the BH-9, the BH-10, and the BH-11, but by the mid-1930s, these were hardly state-of-the-art. If the nation wanted to keep pace with the Bf-109s and Hawker Hurricanes that were emerging abroad, something much more capable was required. 3 aircraft manufacturers would submit proposals. Aero of Prague offered the A7, sometimes listed as the A107. This was a lightweight design built around the modest 450 horsepower Volta Segata IMR, which was an inverted V12. The logic behind this choice of fairly weak engine was that in the case of a conflict, Czechoslovakia would likely encounter difficulties obtaining fuel, and so a plane powered by this engine would allow at least some level of air defense to be fielded. The airframe was to be largely metal with fabric-covered control surfaces and armed with an engine-mounted cannon and twin VZ-30 machine guns in the cowling. It even promised modern niceties such as a retractable undercarriage, hydraulic flaps, pneumatic brakes, and full day and night instrumentation. The second design came from, and I hope I get this right, Ceskoslovenska Letadla. They were known for unusual aircraft layouts. Think of them like a Czech take on Bily.M Voss. Designated E-52, their design was a twin-boom aircraft with a central nacelle and a pair of 220 horsepower Renault engines. Small for a twin-engine fighter, it had a 11-meter wingspan and only an 8.4-meter length. Its configuration faintly was reminiscent of what the Lockheed P-38 would later popularize. Unfortunately, few details of this design survive, so I can't really offer much further comment. However, the lack of details doesn't really matter, as the MNO rejected both of the aforementioned designs, in part because they leaned too heavily into the idea of ultralight, racer-like fighters. Instead, they turned to Avia, by then a reliable supplier of military machines. Avia's proposal was a low-wing monoplane that was powered by the new 1,000 horsepower Hispano-Suiza HS-12 1000Y, offering a clean metal structure and a retractable landing gear. Now, this was much more in line with foreign designs and what the Czech government was hoping to match. Satisfied with the initial proposal, the ministry issued a purchase order calling for 2 prototypes of what would become the Avia B-35. The project was placed under the direction of František Novotný, Avia's chief designer and a specialist in military aircraft whose earlier work included the Avia B-534, another Czech machine that I really need to cover at some point on this channel. Design work started almost immediately, and several scale models underwent numerous wind tunnel tests, ultimately encompassing 104 separate trials to explore radiator arrangements, tailplane configurations, fuselage shaping, wings forms, and flap geometrics. A full-scale mock-up then followed, which was unveiled at the National Air Exhibition in Prague. With a retractable landing gear, elliptical wings, and a neat slot-type radiator under the chin, it looked entirely capable of standing alongside the latest designs emerging from the other European powers without blushing. Reality, however, intervened, and it intervened quite quickly, as it so often did in Europe during the late 1930s. Several critical components were still under development. Chief among them was the intended power plant, which had yet to reach production. Avia therefore had to install the less powerful license-built version of the Hispano-Suiza engine, the 12YDRS, which was producing around 860 horsepower at that time, which was 240 less than the original proposed engine. This engine also required a more conventional, wider radiator intake, and it restricted the prototype to just a two-bladed propeller. To further add insult to injury, the retractable landing gear was likewise not ready, and as a result, the early prototypes were forced to make do with a fixed gear, which obviously hampered performance and testing. Structurally, the aircraft also blended traditional construction with more modern practices. For example, the wings and the horizontal and vertical stabilizers were skinned in so-called armored plywood, which was conventional wood that was overlaid with 0.2mm aluminium sheeting, a technique that was pioneered in France. Control surfaces used metal internal structures with fabric coverings. The fuselage, by contrast, was built around a welded and bolted steel Warren truss, with removable electron panels at the front and a lighter alloy skin aft. Prototype construction was then further delayed because of a setback that occurred during the structural testing of the wings. The casein glue that was bonding the main wooden spars proved inadequate, and it failed well below the required load limits. This required Avia to seek out a replacement, and they eventually replaced it with chlorite resin, which turned out to be a much more stronger adhesive, which proved able to handle much higher loadings of up to 14.8 Gs. Nevertheless, this still resulted in a delay in prototype construction, and as we will soon see, every single day counted in this aircraft's development. Eventually, the first prototype, which is known as B-35.1, took to the air on the 28th of September 1938, with Avia's chief test pilot, Rudolf Delecki, at the controls. His initial flight lasted 18 minutes and produced no issues, which prompted him to take the aircraft up twice more the same day. With these initial flights complete, the prototype was then passed to the VTLU, which was the Aviation and Technical Research Institute for official evaluation. At the institute, several test pilots would fly the aircraft, beginning with Lieutenant Colonel Karel Marisch, and their reactions were consistently positive. Marisch, after only a single flight, would state that he recommended the aircraft for service to the ministry. Through October and November, the aircraft underwent extensive testing, including propeller testing and armament integration. By this point, it had gained its intended 20mm cannon, the machine guns, and bomb racks, and it now reached a takeoff weight of 2,360 kilograms. Unfortunately, it is at this point that another bit of bad luck hampers development. The prototype came to an abrupt end on the 22nd of November 1938. VTLU test pilot Sergeant Arnoš Kavalic had previously remarked how hard the aircraft was to fly in comparison to the Avia B-135 biplanes that he was used to, something many other test pilots, new to high-performance monoplanes, were finding. These challenges would prove to be too much when Kavalic took the B-35.1 on a series of maximum speed tests. When he rapidly transitioned into a turn during one of these tests, one of the wings stalled, and this sent the plane violently into the ground, completely destroying the aircraft and killing Kavalic. Despite this loss, though, the B-35 emerged from the testing phase with its reputation largely intact. 58 flights had been completed without any incident at Avia, and the crash at VTLU was attributed to pilot error rather than any structural flaw. The ministry's assessment stated that the aircraft approached the standards of foreign contemporaries such as the Hawker Hurricane. It was judged a stable platform with good stall recovery characteristics and predictable behavior in dives. Even saddled with the less powerful engine, the prototype reached 485 km per hour, and its takeoff performance in particular was considered excellent. It could take off in 190 meters without flaps, or 111 meters using just 10 degrees of flaps. The design wasn't perfect, and some shortcomings were noted, particularly in cockpit layout and fuel system arrangements, but these were minor issues that were easily corrected in the next prototype, the B-35.2, which first flew on the 30th of December 1938. This second machine also introduced a change to the fuselage behind the cockpit, which replaced the metal skin with fabric covering. Whether this was to simplify construction or save weight owing to the weaker power plant is difficult to tell, as the source material detailing this part of its construction is A, scarce, and B, conflicting. But sources do indicate that MNO had, by this point at least, placed an order for 10 B-35s to be armed with the engine-mounted cannon and a pair of synchronized 7.92mm machine guns. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have carried the aircraft's development into full pre-production and then production. But instead, the crash of the first prototype triggered a lengthy dispute over liability, specifically who would pay for the destroyed aircraft, and this matter dragged on until June of 1939, by which point the situation in Czechoslovakia had changed so drastically that the order itself only really existed as a technicality. Those of you who know your history are probably already familiar with the timeline, but I will just reiterate it for relevance. On the 1st of October 1938, so 8-10 months previously, Germany annexed the Sudetenland. The First Vienna Award soon followed, which transferred additional border territories to Hungary and Poland. Then, on the 14th of March 1939, Slovakia declared independence, effectively splitting the country in two. Then, just 2 days later, what remained of Czech lands, including the Avia factory, was occupied and reorganized as the German Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Avia, along with much of the nation's industry, now found itself under the direct authority of Germany's Reichslufthaftministerium, which is the Reich Air Ministry, and as such, whatever ambitions the MNO once had for the B-35 to enter independent Czech service were rendered irrelevant overnight. During this unsettled period, experts from Germany and its allies visited Avia to assess the state of its aircraft industry. A Bulgarian delegation in February 1939 saw demonstrations of the Avia BK-534 and the B-35.2, and they left impressed, requesting technical and manufacturing documentation. As we will soon see, their enthusiasm would prove important. Representing the Luftwaffe, Ernst Udet also made an appearance, and on the 19th of April 1939, German test pilot Karl Frank flew the B-35.2. According to Avia personnel, he was thoroughly pleased with its handling, an encouraging assessment from someone who was not known for excessive generosity in his praise. Thus, Avia was permitted to resume development, and testing of the second prototype continued. The focus on development now shifted towards refining the configuration that would become the B-35.3, which was ultimately the final military aircraft design that Avia would ever produce. Unfortunately, despite interest in the prototype, progress slowed. Under their new overlords, large portions of the Avia works were diverted to license production of the Arado AR-96, and as a result, the B-35 was pushed steadily down the priority list. After a long pause in flying activity during this turbulent period, test flights finally resumed on the 21st of May 1940, this time with Bulgarian test pilots at the controls. Bulgaria's interest in the design having remained strong since their earliest visit. Unhelpfully, though, their involvement quickly led to the destruction of the second prototype. On the 28th of May, Captain Paganchev suffered a nose-over on landing, flipping the aircraft onto its back. Thanks to a tubular roll bar, he himself escaped the incident uninjured, and the aircraft only sustained minor damage. But with the third prototype now complete, maintaining the second had little purpose, and as such it was scrapped. The third and final prototype differed only modestly from its predecessor. The most practical change was the addition of an access door on the port side of the cockpit, on account that the narrow fuselage of the B-35 had made entering and exiting the aircraft unnecessarily awkward. The new machine also finally received its long-awaited fully retractable undercarriage, which was a Messier oleopneumatic landing gear unit that was sourced from France. The other changes to the design were more geared towards production efficiency. The leading edge of the wing was straightened to simplify manufacturing, and the fuel tanks were rearranged across the wings and central fuselage to improve internal layout and serviceability. Now, as it happened, this prototype had actually first flown all the way back in June of 1939, but, like its predecessor, it spent much of the German takeover grounded. Flight testing resumed in May 1940, but now the aircraft would carry a new designation and a new prospective customer. Although the M&O could no longer support their original order, and the Germans showed little interest in the type, the B-35 had left a strong impression on the Bulgarian observers who had visited Avia the previous year. Their enthusiasm had been stalled by complications of German control, but with the necessary export permits now obtainable from Berlin, the Bulgarian Ministry of War was finally able to approach Avia formally. By early 1940, the arrangements were complete. Bulgaria ordered the fighter under its new designation, B-135, purchasing 12 Avia-built aircraft outright and securing licensed production rights for a further 50 to be manufactured at home. Avia would supply 62 engines, as well as the armament and flight instrumentation required for both the Czech-built and the licensed-built Bulgarian aircraft. In Bulgarian service, the aircraft was to receive the designation of DAR-11, and it was given the name of Letadla, which meant swallow. It was a name that promised elegance. Unfortunately, it was a name that the aircraft would struggle to live up to. Powered by the Avia-built Hispano-Suiza 12YCRS, the production model carried a fully loaded weight of 2,422 kilograms. It offered a range of about 550 kilometers, cruised at 460 kilometers per hour, and could reach a maximum speed of 535. These were great performance figures for its design year of 1938, but less so by the time it actually entered service. By December 1941, approximately 90% of Bulgaria's order had been completed and was awaiting shipment. But once again, wider events intervened. By 1942, the war was no longer an uninterrupted series of victories for Germany, and the Luftwaffe's appetite for engines had grown insatiable. As such, Berlin stepped in and permitted only 35 of the ordered 62 engines to be delivered to Bulgaria, diverting the remaining for their own use. The 12 aircraft that were already completed were packed into crates and shipped off into Bulgaria in late 1942. Unable to obtain the required engines, and now informed that armament and instruments would also be withheld due to a blanket cancellation of contracts between non-Germans and the Protectorate, Bulgaria's interest in the B-135 became non-existent. No DAR-11s would be completed at Lvech, no further orders were placed, and Avia closed the books on the entire thing at a loss. Though production had now ceased and the design was essentially dead, the 12 aircraft that were delivered to Bulgaria would still see service, and they were officially accepted into service on the 28th of August 1943. By then, though, the design was already showing its age. Its Hispano-Suiza engine, which was adequate in 1938, was decidedly underpowered by 1943 standards. Test pilots also criticized the stiff undercarriage, which made taxiing uncomfortable. It was a minor complaint in isolation, but one that did not help the aircraft's reputation for being less refined than its contemporaries that were also in Bulgarian service at this time. The armament, too, belonged to an earlier time. A single 20mm cannon and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns might have been completely competitive at the outbreak of war, but they were wholly insufficient against the aircraft of the Soviet or Allied air forces that were now being fielded 4 years later. In mock dogfights, the B-135's shortcomings became even more obvious. Though it behaved well during ordinary aerobatics, the modifications made to its wing design had clearly brought defects, and its performance dropped sharply when maneuvered aggressively. In one such training engagement, a wing actually bent and began to crack, forcing the pilot to break off his maneuvers and immediately land. Following this incident, the type was placed under strict performance limitations, which effectively removed any prospect of frontline service. As a result, the B-135s were relegated off to training units, but even there they languished. Instructors quickly decided that the aircraft was too difficult to be flown by a novice pilot. You know, the kind of pilot that you would get at a training school. As such, the planes were mostly just left to sit around on the field, occasionally being taken up by instructors who felt daring and wanted to keep some practice in the machines. But there is one final twist to their service. Despite their relegation to training duties, the B-135s would receive one brief and improbable opportunity to see combat. On the 30th of March 1944, the US Army Air Force launched 4 waves of bombers against Sofia, roughly 450 B-17s and B-24s that were being escorted by P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs. The first 3 waves of the attack reached their targets and then withdrew. As they turned for home, they would fragment into smaller formations. This overwhelmed Bulgaria's German-built Freya radar stations, which struggled to track multiple groups simultaneously. The result was that the 4th and final wave went largely undetected until it was almost overhead of Sofia. At this point, most of the Bulgarian Air Force was either still on the ground refueling or too far away to intercept. At Dolna Mitropolia Airfield, the training school where the B-135s were kept, the instructors there could do little but listen as their former students were scrambling in Bf-109s and French-built D-520s, flying off to engage the earlier waves. But when the 4th formation appeared, Flight School Commander Krustyo Antanasov evidently reached his limit. Without authorization, he took off in a B-135 to intercept. He was followed by 3 other instructors, Feldfebel Jordan Ferdinandov, Podporuchik Peter Manilev, and Feldfebel Nedio Kolev. When the 4 of them located the American bomber formation, they realized, uncomfortably, that they were the only Bulgarian fighters still airborne, facing around 60 to 70 American bombers. But fortunately for them, this final wave appeared to be unescorted, and so the 4 of them attacked. Very quickly, the limitations of the B-135's armament became painfully apparent, as multiple passes on the bombers produced little effect. But as the American bombers turned away, having released their payloads, Antanasov and Ferdinandov concentrated their fire either on a B-17 or a B-24, sources do conflict, eventually setting 2 of its engines on fire. Low on fuel, they disengaged and returned to base, reporting that the bomber was descending towards the Yugoslav mountains when last observed. Confirming such claims is always difficult. Bulgarian sources mostly claim a B-24 Liberator was shot down, whereas Czech sources suggest it was a B-17 Flying Fortress. The incident closely matches the timing of the loss of a B-17F, named Vagabond from the 301st Bomb Group, but even US sources conflict. Some list it as being shot down, others say it was lost due to mechanical failure. Its pilot, First Lieutenant William C. Miller, and his crew bailed out, and they spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. This is actually my 3rd time recording this section of the video, as I have been rattling my brain trying to figure out what the exact sequence of events was, but unfortunately the sources conflict too much, so we're just going to take this at face value. All 4 of the B-135s returned safely. If the claim is accepted, it was one of only 4 American bombers lost in that raid, and the only aircraft from the 4th wave to be shot down. But that brief engagement would be the final chapter in the B-135's operational life. The 12 aircraft were never sent into combat again, and they ended the war largely abandoned at their airfield. Their ultimate fate came in 1946, when they were used as live targets during air-to-ground gunnery practice, and none survived. And so ended Avia's last pre-war fighter project, a design that was intended to bring Czechoslovakia level with the major powers, one that showed every sign of being able to compete with the best of its generation at its time, but instead it was overtaken by the political dismemberment of its country before the war had even begun. Its second chance, offered through Bulgarian interest, was undone by German industrial demands, and by the time the aircraft finally reached its customer, it was already outdated, underpowered, and produced in numbers too small to matter. But at least it got its one brief glimmer of glory. A Czechoslovakian plane, piloted by a Bulgarian, engaging American bombers over Yugoslavia. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. Now this will be the first of many videos, perhaps as many as 7, which I hope to release between now and New Year's Eve, as thanks and apologies for bearing with me in my appalling video schedule during the second half of this year. So if you're new here or just stumbled onto this video and you like what you see, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and hopefully 2026 will be a little more stable, but who knows. I have actually made a more structured plan for the new year, and a few sneak peeks at these plans will be teased in the upcoming videos that I release over the coming days, so keep an eye out for that as well. However, that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.